me paint you a Saturday morning, the way it went for 35 years. Walt would be up before me, which was unusual, because Walt was not by nature an early riser. But every other Saturday he was, and on those mornings I would come down to the smell of coffee and find him at the kitchen table in his old green flannel shirt, the one I had long ago given up trying to retire. His tackle box would be waiting by the back door. His fishing rod in its canvas sleeve would be leaned against the frame. He would have made me toast. He would kiss the top of my head on his way out, and he would say the same thing he had said every other Saturday for 35 years. Back before lunch, Helen, save me a plate. And then I would hear the truck start in the drive, and I would have my quiet day. And in the early evening, he would come home, and we would have our supper, and that was that. That was the rhythm of it. Every other Saturday, Walt went to the lake. I want you to hold that picture, the toast and the green flannel and the rod by the door, because it is a good picture, and I lived inside it, contentedly, for 35 years. I'm telling you about it now because 3 months after my husband died, I learned that the fishing rod by our back door had not been wet in over 40 years. And that, I promise you, is not even the hard part of what I learned. My name is Helen. I am 60 years old, and I have spent the last 30-some years as a reference librarian in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is to say, I have spent my working life as the person you come to when you need to find something out. A date, a record, an old address, the answer at the back of a question. I am good at it. I have a researcher's patience and a researcher's stubbornness, and I tell you this now because both of those things will matter, and because there is a deep and particular irony in a woman who finds things for a living, having lived for 35 years, 3 feet away from the largest unfound thing of her life. My husband's name was Walter. Walt. He died in March, very suddenly, of a heart attack, in the garden, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, with a trowel still in his hand. He was 72. There was no illness to prepare me, no slow goodbye, no chance for the conversations people imagine they will always get to have. There was a Tuesday with Walt in it, and then a Tuesday without him, and that was the whole of the warning I was given. We had been married for 35 years. I want to be honest with you about that marriage, because the honesty matters to everything that comes after. It was a good one. I am not telling you a story about a woman who suspected, all along, that something was wrong. I suspected nothing. Walt was kind and steady and quietly funny, and he was the most dependable man I have ever known. In 35 years, he never once raised his voice to me. He remembered the anniversary of my mother's death every year without my ever having to remind him. When I describe Walt to you, I'm describing, with no exaggeration at all, the best man I knew. He was a man of small, faithful habits. He warmed the teapot before he made the tea. He wrote the date on the inside cover of every book he finished, in pencil, in his small square hand. He could not pass a stalled car on the shoulder of a road without pulling over to help, and in 35 years I never once knew him to break that rule, no matter the weather or the hour. I tell you these things because they are, I have come to see, all pieces of the same man, a man who, once he had quietly decided that a thing was his to tend, simply tended it, on a schedule, forever. I had been admiring that quality in my husband at close range for 35 years. I had only ever been shown the small end of it, and every other Saturday, the best man I knew told me he was going fishing, and he was not going fishing. I did not find that out while he was alive. He carried it, whatever it was, all the way to the garden and the trowel and the ordinary Tuesday, and he took the shape of it with him, and if he had had any say in the matter, I believe I was never meant to know at all. What undid the secret was not Walt. It was a cardboard box, and a librarian, and 3 months of a widow having nothing to do with her hands but sort through the leavings of a life. Because that is what you do, in the end. After the casseroles stop coming, and the cards stop coming, and the telephone goes quiet, you are left alone in a house full of a person, and at some point, you have to begin the terrible, intimate work of deciding what stays. And so, in June, I began with Walt's desk. I should tell you about the one closed door, because I want you to see how small it was, how easy it had always been to walk past. I knew that Walt had been married before me. I had always known it, in the way you know a fact about a person that has no temperature to it, the way you know where they were born. He had told me himself early on, when we were courting. He had been married once, young, a long time ago, before I ever met him. It had not lasted, and when he told me this, something in his face had gone gently and firmly shut, the way a man closes a book he is not going to discuss. And being young myself, and in love, and not wanting to press on a tender place, I had let it lie. I did ask, once or twice, in the early years. Not from suspicion, only from the ordinary curiosity a wife has about the country her husband lived in before she arrived. And both times, Walt had answered me the same way. He would say that it had been a sad thing, a long time ago, and that he had been very young, and that there was nothing in it that touched us, and could we please leave it there? He never said it unkindly, but he said it in the way a hand closes around a small wound, and I loved him, and so I left it there. I left it there for 35 years. It became, over time, simply a fact with no weight at all. Walt was married once before. It didn't work out. Folded so far down into the foundation of us that I genuinely, for years at a stretch, forgot that it was there. I want you to understand that this was not a marriage with a shadow in it. People will hear this story and want it to have been. They will want me to tell them that I always felt something, a coldness, a withholding. There was none. Walt was, every single day of our life together, fully present inside it. He was not a man living half in another world. Whatever else this story turns out to be, it is not the story of a husband who loved me less than I believed. I need you to carry that, because I very nearly lost hold of it myself in the weeks I am about to describe. And getting it back was the hardest work I have ever done. So, the one closed door. A brief, sad, ancient first marriage that Walt had asked me, gently, not to open, and that I, loving him, had not. For 35 years, that door cost me nothing. It was just a door. It was painted the same color as the wall. And then I opened Walt's desk and found the box, and learned that the door had never been to an empty room. It was an old cigar box. Walt had a few of them. He kept screws in one and spare keys in another. And I almost did not look inside this one at all, because it was exactly the kind of box a tidy man fills with the small administrative debris of a life. But I opened it, and it was full of receipts. That, in itself, did not alarm me. Walt was careful with money, in the gentle, depression-raised way of his generation. A box of kept receipts was entirely in character. I nearly closed it and set it on the donate pile. But I am a librarian. I cannot help it. When I see a quantity of paper, some old reflex begins, without my permission, to look for the order in it. And so I started, idly, to leaf through. And the order came up to meet me. They were not random receipts. They were, very nearly all of them, from the same two places. One was a café, a place called the Bluebird, and the other was a florist's shop, a little place called Dell's. And every receipt from both places was dated a Saturday. And not every Saturday. Every other Saturday. The dates marched back through the box in their steady, fortnightly rhythm, and the box was deep, and the dates went back years. Years and years. I sat down on the floor of Walt's study with that box in my lap, and I felt the first cold finger of something touch the back of my neck. Because the Bluebird Café and Dell's Florist were not in Carlisle. They were not anywhere near our lake. The address printed at the top of every single receipt was a town called Hartsville, a place I had never had one reason in my life to think about, a little under an hour's drive away. My husband had been buying flowers every other Saturday for as far back as these receipts went, in a town an hour from our home. On the precise mornings he had kissed the top of my head and told me he was going fishing. I am going to be honest with you about what I thought, sitting on that floor, because I think anyone would have thought it, and because I am not in the business anymore of making myself look better than I was. I thought, another woman. Of course I did. 40 years of secret Saturdays and a standing order of flowers. There is one obvious shape that fits those facts, and my mind, frightened, reached for it at once. I sat on the floor of my dead husband's study, and I felt 35 years tilt slowly under me. And then, near the bottom of the box, underneath the last layer of receipts, I found one more thing. It was not a receipt. It was a small laminated card, soft at the corners from years of handling, on a thin lanyard, a visitor's badge, and printed across the top of it were 3 words that I did not understand, that I would spend the next several weeks coming to understand, and that changed, in the end, not only everything I knew about my husband, but everything I understood a marriage could be. The 3 words were Maple Grove Care Center. I did not sleep that night, and in the morning, I did the only thing I have ever really known how to do. I went, and I found out. I drove to Hartsville. I want to tell you that I drove there full of dread, and I did. But I also drove there as a reference librarian, which is to say that underneath the dread was something steadier and older. The simple, settled intention to follow the question all the way to its answer. However, that answer happened to look when I reached it. I did not go to Maple Grove first. I was not ready for the care center. I did not yet know what it was. I went instead to the café, to the Bluebird. It seemed the safer thread to pull. It was a small place, the kind of café a town keeps for decades, and when I asked the older woman behind the counter, carefully, whether she had perhaps known a man named Walt, a tall man in his 70s who might have come in on Saturday mornings, her whole face changed, not with guilt, with fondness, and then, when she saw something in my own face, with a gentle dawning concern, she said, "You mean Walt, who comes in before he goes to see his Ruth." She said it almost as one word, his Ruth, the way you say a thing you have heard a man say 100 times. And then she asked me, kindly, if Walt was all right, because he had not been in for some months, and they had wondered. I told her that Walt was my husband, and that he had died in March. And the woman came out from behind her counter, this stranger, and she held both of my hands, and she told me that he had been one of the gentlest men ever to come through her door, that he had sat at the same table by the window for as long as she had worked there, which was 26 years, and that he always took one black coffee, and that he always took it before and never after. Before he went to see Ruth, never after. I did not yet know who Ruth was, but I was beginning, with that cold steadiness a researcher learns to move through fear with, to understand that I was not going to find an affair at the end of this. The shape was wrong for an affair. Men do not, for 40 years, drink a single quiet coffee and buy modest flowers and have the cafe ladies speak their lover's name with that particular tenderness. This was not the shape of a secret romance. It was the shape of a duty, a long, faithful, fortnightly duty. I drove to Maple Grove that same afternoon. It is a care center, a nursing facility, the kind of place that takes in people whom life has set down somewhere very difficult and who are not going to be getting up again. I sat in the parking lot for a while, and then I went in and I told the truth, because the truth was all I had, that my husband had recently died, that I had found a visitor's badge among his things, that I believed he had been a regular visitor here, and that I did not know who he had been coming to see, and that I would very much like to. The woman at the front desk was about my own age. She listened to all of it, and her eyes filled before I had even finished, and she said, "Oh, you must be Walt's wife." And then she said the thing that finished the slow turning of my entire life around. She said, "He came every other Saturday for 50 years. He came to see Ruth." And then she paused, and she looked at me with an enormous and careful gentleness, and she said, "Did you not know that Ruth was his wife?" I do not remember sitting down, but a moment later I was sitting down, in a chair in that bright reception area, and the woman had come around the desk and was holding out a cup of water that I did not remember being handed. The word she had used, wife, kept arriving in me again and again, the way a bell goes on sounding long after it has been struck. His wife, not a woman. Not, as I had spent a sleepless night and a frightened morning believing, the other woman, his first wife. The single word reorganized everything inside me at once, and I sat in that chair and let it. They were very kind to me at Maple Grove. I think they could see that I needed, more than anything else, simply to be told that the cruelest thing they could possibly do to me in that moment would be to be discreet. So an older nurse, a woman who had worked there for over 30 years and had known Walt for all of them, took me into a small, quiet room, and she told me the story that my husband had not. Walt married Ruth when they were both very young, barely past 20, the two of them, sweethearts from the same small town. And for a little while, they had the ordinary beginning of an ordinary good life. And then, when Ruth was 24 years old, on a morning with nothing wrong with it, a blood vessel deep in Ruth's brain, a flaw she had carried, unknowing, since the day she was born, gave way. She did not die. That is the heart of it, and the very hardest part of it. She did not die. But the Ruth that Walt had married, the laughing girl, the whole person, the wife, that Ruth did not survive the morning, even though her body did. What was left, after the surgeries and the long and terrible hoping, was a woman who would need to be cared for, completely, for the rest of her life. She would not speak again. She would not, as far as anyone in 50 years has ever been able to tell, know where she is, or who is with her, or that any time at all is passing. She was 24 years old. The doctors told Walt, who was 26, that there was no version of the future in which Ruth came back to him. And here is what Walt did, at 26, with that sentence. He did, eventually, the thing that everyone, Ruth's own parents, foremost among them, gently and then insistently, told him that he must do. He let himself, in time, have a life. The marriage was, after some years, quietly and lawfully ended, with the blessing of every person who loved him, so that Walt would not be chained at 29 to a vow that the whole world agreed had already been broken by fate and not by him. He grieved, he healed, the way the young, mercifully, are able to. And eventually, many years later, he met a reference librarian in Carlisle, and he married her, and he built with her a long and genuine and happy second life. But he never told the world that letting himself have that life and letting himself stop loving Ruth were the same act, because for him, they were not. The law had released him. His conscience, it turned out, had filed no such paperwork. And so, every other Saturday, for the next 50 years, through his grief, and through his healing, and through every single year of his marriage to me, Walt got into his truck and drove the hour to Hartsville, and stopped at a café for one black coffee, and stopped at a florist for a modest bunch of flowers, and went and sat beside a woman who did not know that he was there, and kept her company through the afternoon, and then drove home to me and told me that the fish had not been biting. I want to tell you, as honestly as I am able, what it is to receive a thing like that, because it did not arrive as one feeling. It arrived as two, and the two of them did not get along, and learning to let them both live in the same chest has been the work of my last several months. The first feeling was hurt. I am not going to pretend that it was not, or rush past it to reach the nobler thing, because that would be a lie, and you would feel the lie. I was hurt. For 35 years I had believed that I knew my husband completely, believed that the door stood open between us in both directions, all the way down. And I was learning, 3 months too late to say a single word to him about it, that there had been an entire room in him that I was never shown. Every other Saturday of our marriage, more than 800 Saturdays, my husband had been somewhere sacred to him, being someone I had never met, carrying a grief I was never once trusted to help him hold. He had let me think it was fish. For 35 years, he had let me think it was fish. There is a loneliness in learning that, a backward loneliness, and I will not insult you by pretending that I floated serenely above it. But the second feeling came in underneath the first one, slowly, the way warmth comes back into a cold hand. And the second feeling was something I can only call awe. Because what had I actually learned about my husband? I had gone looking, on the floor of his study, terrified, braced for the worst. and the worst had not been there. The very opposite of the worst had been there. I had married a man who, at 26 years old, with the permission of the entire world to walk away, had decided in the privacy of his own heart that some vows do not expire merely because they have become impossible to keep in the ordinary way. A man who had carried a woman who could not know that she was being carried for 50 years, for no audience, for no credit, for no reward that anyone living could ever see. I had spent 35 years certain that Walt was the best man I knew. The box in his study had not contradicted that. It had only told me that I had badly underestimated it. I have had to make my peace with not knowing why he never told me. I have turned it over and over, and I have arrived at no certainty, only a best guess, and I will give you the guess. I do not think Walt hid Ruth out of guilt, and I do not think he hid her out of shame. I think he hid her because that grief was the most fragile thing he owned, and he was afraid, perhaps wrongly, but I have come to understand it, that if he carried it out into the daylight of our marriage, it would stop being something sacred and start being a subject. It would become a thing we discussed and scheduled and asked each other about. Have you been to see Ruth this month, Walt? How was Ruth today, Walt? And I think he simply could not bear, for the one wholly pure thing he did in this world, to be slowly worn smooth by being handled. So he kept it in a closed room. Not from me exactly. Just closed. The way you might cup your hand around a candle to keep it out of the wind. There was a practical fact waiting for me underneath all of the feeling, and it was this. Walt was gone. And that meant that Ruth, a woman of 70 now, who has been in a quiet room at Maple Grove for 50 years, and who does not know that any time has passed, Ruth had, as of March, no one. The man who had appeared at her side every other Saturday for half a century had simply, from inside her endless and changeless afternoon, stopped appearing. She would not know why. She would not know that he had died, or that he had ever come at all, or that there was now a gap where he had been. But the gap would be there all the same. The flowers would stop. The chair beside her would stay empty. I sat with that for about a week, and then, on a Saturday, I drove to Hartsville. I stopped at Dell's, the little florist, and I told the young man at the counter that I would like the usual order. And he knew it without my having to describe it, because of course he did, and the not having to describe it undid me right there at the counter. And then I drove on to Maple Grove, and I signed the visitor's book, and a nurse walked me down a quiet hallway, and for the first time in my life I met Ruth. She is very small. She is silver-haired, and still, and impossibly fragile, a woman the size of a girl, in a chair by a window that looks out onto a courtyard. She did not turn when I came in. She did not know me, and she will never know me. And I understood, standing in that doorway with my husband's standing order of flowers in my hands, that everything I did in that room from that moment forward, I would be doing for no audience at all, exactly as Walt had, for 50 years. I went in. I put the flowers into the water glass on her side table, the way the nurse showed me that Walt always had, and I sat down in the chair beside her, the chair, his chair, still warm in my imagination from 50 years of him. And I did not know what to say, so for a while I said nothing at all, and I simply sat with her and looked out at the courtyard and kept a stranger company. And somewhere in that silence, I understood what I was really doing, and it was not what I had thought. I had believed, driving over, that I was doing something for Ruth, or perhaps something for the memory of Walt. But that was not quite it. Sitting in that chair, I understood that I was finishing my husband's sentence, that Walt had been speaking one long, quiet, 50-year sentence of faithfulness, and that it had been cut off mid-word by a Tuesday and a trowel, and that I, who loved him, could pick that sentence up exactly where he had set it down and go on speaking it. And so that is what I decided, in the chair, that I would do. I go every other Saturday now. I stop at the Bluebird first, for one black coffee, at the table by the window. Before, and never after, the way Walt did, though I could not have told you why he kept that particular rule, and I cannot tell you why I keep it now, except that it feels like a thing he had worked out, and I have decided to trust him. I stop at Dell's, and I sit with Ruth in the chair, and I tell her about my week, or I tell her nothing at all, and the afternoon passes, and I drive home. People who have heard this story sometimes ask me whether it is not strange, or even painful, to spend my Saturdays tending the first wife of my husband. I understand the question, but the answer is no. It stopped being strange almost at once, because Ruth is not my husband's other life. Ruth is the proof of what kind of man my husband was. The very same proof I had been living inside, happily, for 35 years, except that now I have finally seen the size of it. When I sit beside Ruth, I am not sitting beside a rival. I am sitting inside the clearest evidence I will ever have of exactly who it was that I was lucky enough to be married to. Walt's fishing rod is still by our back door, in its canvas sleeve. I have not moved it, and I am not going to. It never caught a fish in all the years I knew him. But I have come to think of it as the kindest lie I was ever told. A green flannel, every other Saturday lie, told by a good man to protect the one candle he was determined to keep burning out of the wind for a woman that the whole world but him had agreed to let go. If you have ever wondered what the people you love do with the hours that you do not see, or if you are quietly carrying a candle of your own, some faithfulness no one knows to give you credit for, then this story was for you. One word in the comments, if it found you. Vow. Just that. I would like to know how many of you are out there keeping one, in a closed room, asking nothing at all for it. Subscribe for new stories, real patterns, full narratives, the long game. 2 small pieces of wisdom from this one, before I go. The first, you will be tempted, when you find a locked room in someone you love, to assume that what is inside it is shameful. We are trained to assume it. A secret, we think, must be a sin's hiding place. But it is not always so. Sometimes the locked room holds the very best of a person, the goodness too tender, or too sacred, or too easily worn smooth, to be carried out into the daylight. Before you decide that a secret is a betrayal, make yourself actually find out what is in the room. You may discover, as I did, that you had underestimated someone for 35 years. The second, we tend to believe that a vow is a transaction, that it holds only for as long as the other person can hold up their end of it, and that when they no longer can, we are released. The law itself often agrees. But I married a man who understood something truer than the law does. He understood that the strongest promises are not the ones we keep because we are being held to them. They are the ones we go on keeping, quietly, in an empty room, long after every person on earth has agreed to let us stop. A vow does not expire just because the world has agreed to release you from it. I'll see you next time.